So, thank you, Tim, for coming today. People might filter in a little bit more, but since you have some time pressure, we'll get started quickly. I've got your book, and it's really good. This one, the American edition took a little bit to come out, but I was flying through London, so I got this at WHF Smith, and I think at the time it was the number one nonfiction book for them.
That was nice.
So
Yeah.
so definitely the revised edition is selling well in the UK, and I haven't looked in the US, but I saw that it came out and it's on Spotify now with an audiobook version that I think that you read,
I did.
which also has been lovely to listen to in the
Oh,
background.
thank you.
Um, and um, it's definitely been updated because there's stuff coming into about the first of the year almost is feels like the cutoff-ish.
I think we got the last final rewrites like the day before it went to print after the inauguration. So I was able to do that. And then you mentioned the audiobook. I was actually ad-libbing at times to make, because, that morning's headlines. Now, normally I just don't take much notice of headlines. It's usually froth. But there's been some fairly big stuff. So I was actually ad-libbing into the microphone at the recording studio. You mentioned it went to number one, and thanks. I figured that the original copy sold 3 million copies around the world over a 10-year period. So obviously there's a percentage of people that will want an update, but there's also a new generation of younger readers. So yeah, I mean, I didn't expect it to go back into the top 10, but yeah, it was in for a couple of weeks and then fell off again.
But I mean, I read it 10 years ago and then returning to it, it's definitely nice to sort of see the work that's gone into bringing things up because a lot has happened in the last 10 years.
Sure.
So in your revising, is there anything that you felt like, why did I put that in 10 years ago? Or it didn't pan out, or sort of has
Um,
things moved over the last 10 years as you thought they might have?
well, I don't want to annoy everybody immediately, but most things were right. I mean, if you can get 6 out of 10 things right, you're a genius.
Yeah.
Um, it's just if you fall into 4 out of 10, then you're an idiot. Um, well, the alternative to the Panama Canal never got. After about 2 feet of digging, they threw the trowel in. So that never went anywhere. I think no. I think most of the trends that were depicted continued, and I suppose as part of the answer to the question, the biggest thing I kind of got right. I didn't say Russia is going to invade Ukraine, but I said it's quite likely Russia will invade Ukraine, and these are the reasons why. And so it was really no surprise, when it actually happened. And you're right about the 10 years, and that was why I did the rewrite and the update, because there are big trends that have continued, but there are also not necessarily that new trends, but trends that have been a long time coming that are now pretty apparent. So, it needed an update. I doubt there'll be another one. Um, 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 I'm done, just about.
So no 2035 edition for 20 years.
I doubt it.
Okay. Um, and then of all your other books, have you thought about returning to any of them? Because you've definitely written a
Well,
bunch of other things.
yeah, I did a book about flags called Worth Dying For, which in America I think had the question mark. I forget which it was, but either the British or the American edition, they put a question mark at the end of it, which is cool. And of course, it wasn't really about flags. It was about identity and nationalism, which are one of the key issues we have at the moment. But and telling those stories through a nation's or an ideology's flag, that doesn't really need updating. so I haven't. A couple of the other books have been, like maybe the following year and the year after, just tweaking and tinkering, just to put some big events in that happened. But no, this is the only one that's it's gone through several iterations. But again, maybe 5 or 6 different reprints, each with a slight update. But this was just starting almost from scratch. It's a third bigger than the original, and I'd say it's about 50% of the stuff in there is new words.
So one of the things that's happened since the inauguration is, of course, there's been a change in the trade situation. So you talk about people moving trade oftentimes from China to other places in Southeast Asia or to Mexico, and the tariff situation has become across the board instead of just targeted at China. So what might have been an acceleration of that
Yes.
is sort of there's a bigger question mark there because, for instance, the Vietnamese really invested in sort of being a trade alternative to China, coming very close to the United States.
Yeah.
And then what happened, they also got, I don't remember the percentage, but it was a
Yeah.
fairly high percentage of tariff on top of their stuff that really makes that much more difficult. So do you think the trends will continue on this, or do you think that this is just sort of a temporary thing and then stuff will snap back?
Yeah,
Or
the latter.
okay.
I mean, look, it won't snap back to exactly as it was before, but it will be similar. And again, these were trends that were already emerging, partly because of COVID. We were already all over the world. People were looking at either at friendshoring or reshoring. People saw the supply chain issues, and COVID laid that bare. And so that accelerated an existing trend. Mexico, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Indonesia becoming power. They had all read this future, and they were all positioning themselves to be low-cost manufacturing alternatives to China. Now, the tariffs, well, Trump 1.0 did something similar in his first or second year, I forget which. Not quite as dramatic as this time, but within a year, it would almost return to how it was before. And I think that will be the case again. The sky has not fallen. The world has not come to an end just because this guy wakes up one morning and says 200%, and then the next day says 90%, and the next day says 120%. The world doesn't look that much different. And he is simply, anyway, a symptom. He's not a cause of what's going on. So I'm relatively sanguine about the trade aspect. I'm less sanguine about some other aspects of what's going on.
So one of the things that sort of you sometimes put stock in, sometimes don't put stock in, is the idea that the worst enemy of lots of people is themselves. So you talk about that sort of in a Russia context, but right now it feels like with my home country, the United States, we're starting to see sort of the start of, well, maybe the worst enemy of the United States is the United States itself. And definitely in Europe, the worst enemy of the EU is the EU, it tearing itself apart,
Yeah,
either over the French. You think you called it the warm embrace of the French and the Germans to keep each other from punching each other,
that's the
and
raison d'etre of the EU. I mean, there's a lot more comes out from it, but the number one thing is you guys hug each other so tight you can't. Yeah, and it's worked, and that's the genius of the EU. But then it becomes this behemoth. Yeah, but the States has been through this before. I mean, I'm hoping you're not heading back towards an 1860, 1865 situation. But there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack there. But George Washington's farewell address told the Americans, don't involve yourself in these idiotic arguments with the Europeans are having. have had, and will always have with each other. And America actually, for what is that, 150 years or something, took that good advice. And then it only got involved in 1917. You could say it came to save democracy, but I don't believe that. It came to make sure that no one big power arose on the European continent. And when it achieved that, it went home again. And then it had to come back again in 1944 for the same reason. And this time they thought, well, it's cheaper just to stay because now we've got another big power, the USSR. Saw them off. Oh, bloody hell, they're at it again. Biden decides to help with Ukraine. And then that idiot Putin proves to MAGA Americans that they can't even reach Kyiv, never mind the bloody Atlantic coast. At which point, it makes, from their perspective, a lot of sense to, guys, sort yourselves out and we can have a relationship. If you don't sort yourselves out, we're off. Bye. Thanks. And this was summed up brilliantly by Tusk, the Polish leader. He said, explain to an American taxpayer why 600 million Europeans are asking 340 million Americans to protect them from 140 million Russians. And he's right. Why the hell should you guys be paying for it? We do have to step up. So these, again, are long trends. Now, that's what I'm less sanguine about, because I personally am an Atlanticist and would like the relationship to be maintained. And I suspect, actually, it will be, but it may not be. What was the other bit? Sorry, I went off on one about America. And what was the first bit of it?
It's mostly
EU.
that the tearing itself apart, either the
Yeah,
United States or the EU or China or Russia.
Yes, but did it not do that to an extent in the Great Depression? Less so. Kent State shootings in the same ballpark period as Martin Luther King assassination, JFK, RFK, Watts riots, etc., etc. Vietnam and the demonstrations. Was not America tearing itself apart at that point? Yes. Is it at the moment? Yes. It's possibly worse now than it was then. I think the divisions may be wider and deeper. I suspect you will re-energize and reinvent yourselves again. But yeah, there are some pretty deep fissures in the States, and it is worrying.
Something sort of, that I always try to keep in mind about that period is that Americans under-index the number of bombings that happened, that there were bombings and shootings, and the armored car would get shot up to take the money for some Cuban something or other. Like there's a bunch of these things, terrible things that happened in the 70s that sort of, as Anna said in the chat, almost cultural amnesia, that
Didn't the
we've
FBI bomb a
forgotten
house
that.
in the air in Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forget it was the FBI or if it was the local police, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Britain in some ways has forgotten I was listening to the rest is history yesterday about 1974, about how painful the 70s was.
3-day week. I was a kid then, teenager. I loved the 3-day week because we only went to school for 3 days in the week because they couldn't put the lights on because of the strikes. That was great. Loved it. We had candles in the evening. Anyway, sorry, do carry on.
But so we definitely have at least in the United States, have a fairly short memory on things that today, a very strong recentism bias. Unrelated, but since we were talking about the US, do you think Brexit's going to be reversed, or do you think that's sort of a permanent, or do you think this idea of the Anglosphere, where the UK gets closer to its former colonies in the Australia and Canada and New Zealand, that sort of floats around in the conservative ethos in the United Kingdom, will come about? Or do you think
No to your first question about Brexit being reversed. One of the problems would be the utter sense of betrayal. We're not France. We don't keep asking people to vote until these idiots give the right answer, which is what the French did. You know, what do you mean you voted the way the elite doesn't want? Right, we'll ignore that. We'll have another one. You've done it again. We'll ignore that. We'll have another one. Thank you. You've got the right vote now, you fools. We don't do that. And the sense of betrayal. I voted Remain. I'm not a Brexiteer. I would be horrified if there was another referendum within the next decade, because I think it would be so anti-democratic, so arrogant to do such a thing to all the people that voted in good faith, thinking that their vote actually counts and that the elite doesn't say, oh, they've got it wrong, and therefore we'll ignore them. No, it would be a disaster. But what is happening is that we are trying to find as many ways as possible to forge relationships again. There's a new thing, for example, that young Europeans and young Brits will be able to go abroad to study and to work for temporary periods. The European Space Agency, our relationship is really, really good within that. So that's not going to be reversed. The Anglosphere, it already exists culturally, and it already exists politically within Five Eyes, the intelligence gathering of the five Anglo-speaking nations, which is possibly the tightest intelligence defense entity there is in the entire world, entire history of the world as well. So that's thriving. But no, we are still trying to balance between the Americans and the Europeans. We've been trying to balance in Europe for 400 years. We always tried to divide the Europeans from one entity getting too powerful. So we would get in and try and split them. So at one point we'd be with Russia, and then we'd be with France, and then we're going to ally with Portugal, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And since the Americans came in, we've always tried to balance between the two, and we're continuing. Now, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. If Biden was genuinely the last Atlanticist president, and Trump is not an aberration, and whoever follows him does not return to the Atlanticist American viewpoint, at that point, then we have a massive, massive decision to make. Do we go with Europe or do we go with the States? The way things are at the moment, we can still afford to hedge. We don't want to have to make that decision. And what the next 4 years are partly about is if we and our fellow Europeans can prove to the United States that we are actually grown-up countries that don't need to have our noses wiped and our hands held by the Americans, which is what has happened over the past 70 years. We can't even field a division of 10,000 fighting men for more than a few weeks. That's how bad things are. And even if we could, we can't get them anywhere because we have no heavy lift capability. Because we thought, oh, the Americans will, they'll take us. Well, they might not. So if we can spend the next 4 years growing up, getting back into, sadly, reality after our ridiculous holiday from history, which only ever existed in European intellectual minds anyway, the rest of us knew exactly that this isn't going to last. This is not normal, what's going on at the moment. The last 2,000 years is what's normal. Why are you mistaking now for normality? Anyway, if we
Interesting, in the middle of that holiday from history was the Yugoslavian experiment, that all of that happened just south of Germany, and still that didn't, in 2000, in the late 90s,
Wonderful. My friend Jakša Skekic, I spent a lot of time during the Balkan Wars with, a Serb. He used to say to me, Yugoslavia, it was a lovely idea. And so many Yugoslavs felt that way. And then the old map resurfaced through the new map. So, I never mistook what was going on and our so-called peace dividend and the end of history rubbish that
Hmm.
Fukuyama wrote and has ever since then been trying to say, well, actually, what I meant was, no, if you look at the paragraph where the end of history comes in, it is crystal clear he is saying this is the norm and this is the future of humanity. Anyway, point being, if we can do that, I think the Atlantic relationship can be salvaged. We've dropped the pretense that America was just first amongst equals. It was always first, but they were polite, we were polite. Yeah, first amongst equals. That pretense has gone now. I think the relationship can be salvaged, but if it can't, then that is the great historic split and divide.
That makes sense. One of the things that I've been seeing sort of since the administration's newer policy about Europe is there's this almost rush of the old great powers to fill the vacuum of who is going to be the leader. So Paris, Berlin, and London sort of it's back to them duking out who is really the first
Yeah.
great power on the continent between themselves. Who do you think
Whereas
is
in fact, the coming power is Poland.
you think Poland is going to be the sort
Oh yeah,
of okay.
first
Is it just
division or
because they
Premier
have the
League.
largest military and the most spending, or is it
They're just a vibrant country that are on the right track. But you're right. I mean, it's a sad fact, and I don't want it to be true. But hard power via military power still is currency, and they have that. And they are also in a part of Europe that is now more of a focus. The weight of focus within NATO has shifted to the high north and the
Mhm.
eastern flank, and they are well positioned to do that. But you're right. It was the great old powers still pretending that they were great old powers, but not even being able to fight their way out of a paper bag,
I,
a wet paper bag for that matter.
interesting thing about Poland is that Polish history is sort of being the soccer ball or the rugby ball of European fights across the great European
Yeah,
plain, so that they then decided once they got independence to sort of turn into a porcupine of sorts after after the last time they were invaded by both the Brits and the Russians. So they're
yeah,
in there
and the
and
Swedes.
parts of the
Don't be fooled by ABBA. Swedes invaded them as well and went through them towards Russia. Look, I'm glad you mentioned that. Look, because this is part of the concept of prisoners of geography, which is not that you are entirely in a prison and you can't do anything. It's just that what you can and cannot do is within the geographic frame. And so Russia, with its lack of warm water ports, its lack of direct access to the oceans, it has no direct access to oceans. It wants to control Poland because when you look at the map, it's flat ground that starts in France. It then narrows as it reaches Poland. That's the narrowest point. And then it opens out again in front of the centers of power, St. Petersburg and Moscow, also flat, and it's flat all the way to the Urals. So if people with ill intent towards you have come through that gap time and again, of course, Russia will seek to control the gap, which is why Poland keeps changing size
Mhm.
in different centuries and sometimes disappears from the map completely. It's on the superhighway of cavalry. Plan B is to control the flat ground once you're through Poland and it opens out. And so if Ukraine decides to do what every single other country in that entire neighborhood decided to do, which is say thanks for nothing, bye to the Russians, and can we be friends, please, to the people to their west? Every single person did that, every country. Then they, not being a liberal democracy or any form of democracy, acted. I mean, there are many other reasons than geography, but that geographic framing is among the rationales that Russia has for its brutal, illegal invasion of a sovereign country.
So, as we talk about Ukraine, they just pulled off a major operation definitely, um, you use the Bismarck quote about how God protects children drunks in the United States of America, and we might have to include Ukraine on that list because they're definitely doing a lot. They're taking chances, and well, I guess they have to take
Yeah.
chances because they're of the situation they're in. It's partly paying off for them. How do you think this is going to end? Do you think it's going to be divided? Do you think
Yeah.
because
Oh, yeah.
pushing the Russians out, it seems of like a fairly tall order.
Well, I doubt very much that will happen. I mean, the three scenarios. One, they get pushed all the way back to what the Russian border. That's the least likely. Um, Option two, they make it all the way to the Polish border. I think that's unlikely. And option three, at some point, this stops. I thought it was going to be this year, but that's looking difficult now. And it's divided because essentially it already is. You know, there is a de facto division. That 20% that they've got, I suspect they're going to hold most of it because Ukraine's challenge is simply to make sure they don't lose any more. I don't think they're capable of going back on the major offensive in order to push those lines back. I just can't see it. And so they pull off amazing, audacious operations like the drone attack last week. Yeah, last week, early last week, which was stunning. But actually, that I'm glad you mentioned that. That's rooted in geography. The rationale of that. They went after the long-range bombers,
Mhm.
um, and they took some of them out. It's disputed whether it was 10 or 30, whatever it is, they took clearly some of them out. And that means that the Russians cannot fly as many long-distance missions with standoff weapons of no danger to themselves while they attack Ukrainian cities. And what that does is it forces them to use things closer to the
Mhm.
Ukrainian front lines. And what that does is put them within range of Ukraine. So, you know, it wasn't just about hitting the long range bombers because you could, it was about forcing your enemy to come closer to you so you can hit them. And that was all based in geography. Um, yeah, that's my shtick, if you like,
Mhm.
focusing on geography. But I am aware that there are many other aspects to what goes on.
One of the interesting things is that those bombers were probably built in Ukraine during the Soviet era,
Yeah,
and several of them have not been built since I was born in the 90s, if not
yeah.
longer. So it even if damaged, your ability to replace parts
No, they're done.
is
They don't make them anymore. There's the Tupolovs, I think.
yeah.
They don't make them anymore, and so you can't replace them. And this again is an argument the Trump administration doesn't seem to internalize that America, if it sees Russia as a second tier threat, because you
Mhm.
know they're not front and center for the Americans at all, but even if you think of them as a second tier threat, well, the Ukrainians are busy diminishing that threat for much cheaper than it would be if the Americans were. But for reasons best known to himself, Mr. Trump doesn't see it that way. Maybe he's just looking at the deals. I'm not sure he has the hinterland for deep strategy. I mean, you're probably aware of the American concept of what was it? Strategic restraint. Strategic
Mhm.
restraint. They knew that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Yeah, they're first amongst equals. They could do a lot more, but it's good for America and useful to be part of the democratic family and to have bases at Ramstein in Germany, Suda Bay in Crete, that big one they're building in Romania, Lakenheath in the UK, the listening posts they have in, it's useful for them to be there so they can be strategically restrained because it's win-win. But again, I don't think MAGA Americans look understand the concept of win-win. They only sound 1-0.
That makes sense. One of the things that sort of the United States is also getting out of Ukraine is a lot of data because there's a lot of the stuff that we've given them that has not really ever seen a peer-ish adversary. So lots of the things that are getting shot, we really had no idea against other tanks how would it really
Yeah.
work because outside of
Yeah.
Saddam in the 90s at the height of his power, that's really the last time some of this kit has actually seen.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Tom,
Yeah.
because everyone calls this the first drone war, but it's not. 3 years ago, Azerbaijan and Armenia went to war over
Hmm.
Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Armenians were doing that classic thing of fighting the last war. And they put all their armor up very close to the front, tanks, armored cars, you name it, APCs. What the Azerbaijanis have been spending the last decade doing is buying Turkish drones, Bayraktars, and they just smashed the Armenian army armor in about 3 days, and it was over, and they lost. Armenia lost Nagorno Karabakh essentially. That was the first drone war. And the smart militaries all over the world went, whoa, and started studying it. There are people in my own country who studied it, but we have a moribund procurement environment within our Ministry of Defence. It's a national scandal, I think, how much money they waste. And we've only actually woken up, I'd say, about a year ago about drones. Because tanks, they still have their use. And your initial point, you're absolutely right. The whole world learned an awful lot about what will work and what won't work, and what types of weapons will and won't work, and whether the hypersonics can be defended against. Not really. Can the drones hit cruise missiles to stop them coming in? It's all that stuff. Everyone's been on a very steep learning curve, but drones are where it's at.
One of the interesting things that I'm seeing is that it isn't so we think drones, we think from radio frequencies, well, those get jammed. So the next thing is that they have basically long fiber optic cables on them, and they're all by wire. So it feels like you almost have gone backwards.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
But
that's
that
innovation, isn't
is,
it?
yeah.
It's innovation in a way. But you're right. It's almost like going backwards. But there is something going very forwards, and that's the direct energy weapons, which are beginning to be introduced. Because at the moment, when you fire an anti-cruise missile at a cruise missile,
Hmm.
you're spending the best part of $100,000 to
Yeah.
hit it, and it's amazing hitting a bullet with a bullet. But the new stuff, which the Americans developed, Britain has it, several countries has it, is a direct energy which burns the chips out of the nose of the incoming missile for about $1 worth of electricity. And so that's real innovation. As an aside, I wrote another book called Future Geography about the geography of space and
Hmm.
the astropolitics, geopolitics up there. And I am convinced that we will be putting these weapons on our satellites eventually, which is very sad. Sorry that I've gone off subject a bit, but yes, your question is right. There's been a lot of innovation and learning from this awful event in Ukraine.
So from the chat, Trey asks, would you agree that geography should be almost a core class in the study of geopolitics, that you can't really understand geopolitics without
Yeah,
geography?
very much so. And I actually think to a degree it is becoming so. Geopolitics was very unfashionable for a very long time, especially after World War II, because the Nazis bastardized it, and there was a version of it with Lebensraum. Yeah, and also, the way it's taught now in many modern universities in Europe and the UK, the classic geography that my generation grew up learning, which was soil samples, which if you ever
Hmm.
want to, if you get insomnia, read something about soil samples, pH balances and things. They're now introducing, human geography, how terrain affects energy. They're bringing the whole thing together, which is where it should be. And certainly international relations courses now also are beginning much more to factor in geography. So yeah, absolutely, because I make the contention that to understand a picture, maybe it's got or jigsaw 20 pieces, but if you have not put the geography bit in, you really are not seeing a proper picture.
That makes sense. Moving to the Pacific, you sort of write about China's desire to control sort of island chains coming out from their coast, but also those island chains are blocks. So, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I found that fascinating.
Yeah, it's a relatively simple concept. And I use a map, I hope, in the book, where you look outwards from China,
Hmm.
outwards to the Pacific, because all our maps, we're always sort of looking inwards. And it's the same, you need to put yourself in Moscow's head and look westward to get
Hmm.
a better feel for what their rationales. They may be wrong, but at least you understand them. China looks outwards towards the Pacific and sees in front of it non-stop friends of America, including American troops, including the
Yes.
Seventh Fleet in Tokyo, Tokyo Bay, all the tens of thousands of American troops in South Korea, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, American ally, not a treaty ally, unlike the other two, and then another treaty ally in the Philippines, basic
Hmm.
rights for the US Navy, and round. And it would be really relatively easy to blockade China. You simply block those gaps between in the wall, and nobody wants to do that. But a great power will not allow, will try not to allow the possibility that it could happen. And Taiwan is the biggest brick in that wall, which is why it's the flashpoint. But there are many other flashpoints, and they're all actually related to the South China Sea in general. Because if you can break the potential to be blocked, then you are past the first island chain, as it's
Hmm.
called, and then you're out of the South China Sea and you're into the Pacific. After that, it gets a bit more grandiose. So there is the second island chain, but that's like 3,000 miles away. But the first thing you have to do is be master of the South China Sea and get through that, and then you're out into the ocean.
So the Philippines famously kicked the Americans out and then sort of now is letting the Americans come
Yeah.
back in. That was, of course, under the previous administration. I don't know what the current policy looks like. Um, do you think that that's like a return to uh, uh, what return to the mean, or do you think or do you think Beijing's going to try to push on to push the Americans out of the Philippines? Because
Yeah,
that's definitely looking at that wall there. The Philippines is
oh,
almost one
huge.
of the um, great hard points in that. And
Yeah.
if you could,
Yeah.
if you
There's
could
a strait
soften that,
between Taiwan and the Philippines. There's a strait you'd have to go through to get out. And that's why the Americans have got the basing rights on that part of the Philippine coast. Um, it's returning to the mean, and it will continue to be so. And the Chinese 100% will continue to try to um, persuade the Philippines, for example, not to be a friend of the United States. And they were having some success when Dirty Harry, as we called him, Duterte,
yeah.
was in charge, and he's now in a jail in the Netherlands, I believe, but that's another story. So Marcus comes in and very quickly reverses everything, grants these 5 extra bases to the United States to visit and stockpile. But that will only be the case as long as the Philippines is confident that
Hmm.
America's got their back. Because if they're not confident, what's the point of being an ally of America? And if you're not confident that America's got your back, at that point, you have no choice except to start leaning towards Beijing because you can't stand up to Beijing. You can't on your own. You can only stand up to Beijing if you've got the Americans who've got your back. And that's why, for example, when it comes to the Scarborough Shoal, these little, some of them just little rocks sticking out of the water, which the Philippines deliberately beached a boat, a ship, small
It's a
ship.
World War II era
Yeah, that's right. And these poor
rusting
Philippine
hulk.
sailors. I've got a new posting for you. You're going to live on this wrecked World War II boat on a reef, hundreds of miles from anywhere. But don't worry, the Coast Guard will pop along every couple of months and to give you some food. And of course, the Chinese Coast Guard rocks up there and blocks the supply vessel and rams it and all the rest of it. And the only way the Philippines can be robust and continue their version of geography, which is that this is Filipino territory, is because America's got their back. If they didn't, they would just have to eventually say, oh, you have them then. And it's the same with Taiwan. And this is why strategic ambiguity still partially holds. The Chinese genuinely do not know if the Americans would or would not fight for Taiwan if it was invaded. And that's a hell of a restraining factor. And they know that the Americans obviously have gained this out. The Americans know, I hope the current administration knows, that if they didn't come to Taiwan's aid, at that point, the Philippines thinks, what's the point? If you're not going to help them, you're hardly going to help us. So, and gradually, you lean towards Beijing. So all these are different friction points are all actually related to each other, and it's about the South China Sea, not just each individual part of it.
Okay. So in, I think it was March, one of the first countries to sort of waver on the United States was Singapore, whose chief of the military in a speech basically said we need to we need to divide. I forget exactly what it was, but the point is basically we need to diversify where we get our security from. And
Yeah.
for a country like Singapore, you're a city state next to Malaysia who kicked you out, and you're in a very strategic place, you're very wealthy, but you could easily be carpet bombed pretty much out of existence. So, um, what do you think the future of somewhere like Singapore is? Is it moving closer to the Australians? Is it the
Quite a long
Chinese?
way away,
Because
aren't
there is
they?
a cultural link there
Yeah.
between Singapore and China. Is it
Oh, yeah.
India?
Well, yeah, because as soon as you come out the other end of the Malacca Strait, you're in the Indian Ocean, and the Andaman
Yes.
Islands are right there, which is why the Indians are busy building up their defenses in the Andaman Islands. Um, by coincidence, I was with some Singapore cyber military people last week who had come over to London, and they were saying, push comes to shove, they'll stick with the Americans if the Americans will stick with them. I think what the Singapore leader was getting at is the same as what we were talking about earlier with we need to plan over the next few years to be ready that if the relationship is broken, we have options. Because if we do
Hmm.
nothing and we are defenseless, and in 4 years' time, they really do break the relationship, what the hell are we going to do? So we have to spend 4 years giving ourselves options that yes, we're a reliable partner, or if there is no partnership, we have options. And I think that's what
Hmm.
the Singapore leadership was saying. But at the moment, all of the countries we mentioned, Australia, Singapore, Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, all want to stick with the United States. And for one reason only, China.
Hmm. In some ways, it feels like the United States has been given an impressive hand that in so the normal thing in geopolitics to do through the Victorian era through World War II is sort of you play both sides off on each other and you try to come out on top. And instead, both China and Russia freak out their neighbors to such a degree that they have abandoned the what what Siam did and what Persia did, the playing off the Russians and the Brits to instead deciding strongly on one side. Do you think that's going to continue this sort of, or do you think we're going to return to sort of an earlier era of we're friends sometimes to you, we're friends sometimes to you? How can we play everybody off to basically be on this narrow, what Finland did during the Cold War? They say on the knife edge, but
Yeah.
if you are balanced, no one will touch you. Do you think we can return to that as China grows in power?
I think everyone's always balanced as and when they needed to. I mean, I think it was you're probably aware of Palmerston's, nations have interests, not friends.
Hmm.
Um, I'm afraid that's mostly true with some nuance. Um, yeah, everybody will balance and will continue. Well, actually, I say that Finland has made its choice, hasn't it? It's
Yes.
joined NATO, and it took the shock of what happened in Ukraine for Finland to be so shocked into actually no longer balancing. And it
And
took,
Sweden.
yeah, well, and the thing about Sweden is they really did take a holiday from history, a 200-year holiday
Yeah.
from history. After the Napoleonic Wars, they just said, all right, look, we took such a kicking. You lot get on with it. We're out of the game. And for 200
Hmm.
years, they were. I mean, it's amazing. And again, it shows you, especially for people not in Europe, when they look at what has happened in Europe and perhaps don't always understand the psychological shock. It's a little bit like I don't think the world understands the shock of 9/11 to Americans, because Americans think no one can come and get them, which is mostly true. 3,000 miles of water that way and that way, ice up there and a desert down there. No one can come and get you. And then, 3,000 people died because somebody got you. And the psychological shock to America and how it lashed out, I don't think is widely appreciated globally. And I think perhaps people outside of Europe don't understand the psychological shock to us. But I think that's a really good example to explain the shock, that it shocked Sweden out of 2 centuries
Hmm.
worth of not being aligned. Quite amazing. Sorry, I haven't really answered your question because I think people are always balancing. I
Okay.
mean, sometimes even within NATO, Turkey tries to play several games at once. Within the EU, most of
Yes.
the EU countries are, firstly out for themselves, and then if it suits them, they will play ball with the concept of shared responsibility and obligations.
So we have 10 more minutes with you. So, sort of one of my last questions is, so the academic sort of criticism of you and sort of other writers
Who
of
are
sort
these
of
people?
the
Give me their names.
of popular geography is that they're super strong geographical determinants, and academic geography almost hates the idea of geographical determinants. They really like this idea that anything can happen at any time for any reason. Are you actually a fairly strong geographical
No,
determinant
I'm not,
belief,
but I've
or
been
do you
accused of
think
it, and I
that
just think to myself, hang on a minute.
yeah.
A couple of reviews of the book have said, "Oh, this is geographic determinism." I think, well, hang on. I say at least 5 times in this book that this is just one of the factors you have to factor in. I mean, how is
Hmm.
that determinism? For me, it's just common sense. Yes, you have to factor in the great leader theory of history, the great intellectual thought theory of history, the cultural theory of history, science, technology, movement of people. Yeah, you name it, you've got to be looking at it. But 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 to say that geography doesn't have a significant impact on what happens, I just think is a ludicrous idea. Now, here's an example. Was it just a complete mystery or coincidence that Britain went around and robbed the whole world blind? Or is it because we've got a jagged coastline, which allows a deep water port? And then we've got big, long, flat rivers that come inland, allowing us, to get things in by water, which is cheaper than moving by things by land, and out. And
Hmm.
when we wanted to go and rob everybody, I'm sure that wasn't our original idea. What have we got? Lots of trees, oak trees, big, fantastic wood to build big, heavy ships for big ports. Now, they didn't do so much of that in Somalia for very good reasons. They haven't got a deep water port, they haven't got long, flat rivers, and they haven't got hardly any wood. So, how is Britain's geography not directly related to its history? And then when we switch from sail power to coal, what have we got?
A lot of coal.
I just find it. I just cannot understand why people don't accept that it is, at the very least, a significant factor in what happens.
That makes sense. And I will give the last question to the chat. Later today, there's another salon on building cities with more of a global citizen and borderless theme. If you're familiar with the budding building cities movement, what are your thoughts?
Could you say the bit about?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that. If you're familiar with the idea of building sort of global cities or borderless, the movement towards that, what are your thoughts?
We will always have borders. You can call them other things if you want, but we'll always have them. And if you don't like them, and you're lucky enough to live in a house, knock on your neighbour's door when you get home tonight, and you say, I've had a great idea. You know that fence between our, let's rip it down. You're not going to do it because you like your fence. You like your border. And we always have done. I don't necessarily like that I think that's true. I wish it wasn't true. I'd like to hug every tree I see. But I just don't think that is doable. So you might think that's facile. I'll give you another potentially facile one. I've waved a magic wand and there are no more borders. This is great. And well, it hasn't even got a name, but this island that I happen to be on, up on that coast there, fantastic. Lots and lots of people that do fishing to sustain the area around here. It's great. But unfortunately, these blonde people from that big island over there that we used to call Denmark have started coming in greater numbers with their ships. And we love them, of course, because there's no borders. There's no them and us. We're all just one. But they've started coming more and more, and they're doing more and more fishing. And we haven't got enough fish for it. So at that point, we're going to have to talk. So who's going to represent us? Okay, so we've now got a leadership. Right, what are we going to say? Well, we're going to say, could you only come as far as this? Well, what the hell is that if it's not a border? How the hell are you ever not going to have a border? And when you're decommissioning your nuclear power station, you say, I'll tell you what, we'll stick it all on this big ship, and we'll go and dump it over there. And they'll say, well, hang on a minute. There will always be borders. So what I think you can mitigate against overt competition and hostility, but I think it is flying in the face of both logic and every single piece of recorded history to think that we will not have borders in one shape or another. And I'll end on a positive note. I've always thought the upside of intergalactic warfare is that at that point, when Mars attacks, at last we won't have us and them here. It'll all be us, and we'll have another them.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
The new version
at the screen at the moment, I'm sorry.
The new version of Prisoners of Geography is out, and you can find it at any bookseller, and the audio version is on Spotify. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for putting up with me, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.